friends, come cook Sunday dinner with me. Today I'm making Marcella Hazan's Bolognese, the recipe for which I got from Letti's Culinaria, which makes a beautiful all-day sauce perfect for luxuriating over on a lazy Sunday. Sweetened with rich whole milk, a heavy amount of white wine, and pulling from my stores of homemade tomato puree, it's a perfect winter meal to be slathered over homemade pasta and eaten with relish. Now, I always make double the recipe and freeze half because if you're going to spend roughly 5 hours making something, you might as well make some extra. For this recipe in this quantity, you're going to need the following: 4 tablespoons of oil, I use olive oil, 16 tablespoons of unsalted butter divided. Remember, this is a double recipe. Then for diced vegetables, you'll need 2 cups of onions, 2 2/3 cups of both celery and carrots, 1 pound of well-marbled ground beef. I'm using my usual dry-aged local beef from Austin Ridge Acres. You'll also need 1 pound of ground pork. Mine is also from a local source that is pastured, and as you can see, it is nearly as dark and beautiful as the beef. You're also going to need salt and pepper, 4 cups of whole milk, room temperature if you can, a 1/4 teaspoon of freshly grated nutmeg, although I often add a bit more, 4 cups of dry white wine, which should be roughly 1 whole bottle plus a little extra, 6 cups of homemade tomato puree or canned Italian San Marzano tomatoes, crushed by hand, which I'll show you how to do later. And according to this recipe, as much pasta as you wish. It says Marcella prefers tagliatelle, but I like to use something more akin to a pappardelle, which I'll show you how to make next. Also, you can never forget freshly grated Parmigiano Reggiano, or as my dad would call it, the king of cheeses, for the top. Let's get started. Actually, a quick note. Before we get started, if you think I'm pronouncing things like a total tool, please know this is more or less how I grew up pronouncing these things in a partly Italian household. Obviously, both my American and Massachusetts accents playing a role, and the fact that my father, who taught me these things, passed away nearly 10 years ago, so my exposure has diminished considerably. But with a few quick Google searches, I was able to more or less jog my memory. Either way, I'm doing my best here. Anywho, on with the recipe. The first thing I'm going to do is heat the oil in about 12 tablespoons of the butter in a heavy 5-quart Dutch oven over medium heat until the butter stops foaming. Then I'm going to add in the onions and just start them to cook until they're soft and translucent, which should take about 5 minutes. Then I toss in the celery and carrots, toss to coat, and cook for an additional 2 minutes. Then you are going to add in your beef and your pork, and it calls for a very generous pinch of salt and a goodly amount of pepper. You're going to crumble the meat with your wooden spoon and keep stirring it until the meat has lost most of the red color. Now, you're not going for caramelization on the meat, you're just getting it slightly cooked and broken apart because it's going to be simmering for a really long time. Then you're going to reduce the heat to low, pour in your milk, and simmer gently, stirring frequently until the liquid has bubbled away almost completely. This should take about an hour. The slow cooking of the milk looks really gross, I'll be perfectly honest, but it makes the sauce incredibly sweet. Next, you're going to stir in the nutmeg and then pour in the wine and gently simmer, stirring frequently until it's evaporated. It's going to take about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. Meanwhile, I like to stage my ingredients for the next step, which is tomatoes. As you see, I added my jarred San Marzano tomatoes to a wide measuring cup, and I crushed or squished them by hand, being careful to keep my hand down in the sauce so I don't splatter tomato sauce everywhere because it basically looks like a crime scene. I didn't do a great job. You're going to add your tomato puree and crushed tomatoes and stir well. As you can see, I had some very eager helpers here to stir because you do want to stir it frequently. You're going to add this, and when the sauce begins to bubble, you're going to turn the heat down very low so that it, quote, cooks at the laziest of simmers with just an intermittent bubble breaking through the surface. Now, I was actually sort of running out of time here, so I cooked it a tiny bit higher than this for a tiny bit less time. It calls to cook this uncovered for 3 hours or more, stirring from time to time. I managed to do mine in about 2 hours, and it was still perfectly delicious. It does say that if the sauce starts to dry out, you can add a half a cup of water at a time, but I rarely have this problem if I cook it over the full 3 hours on extra low heat on my range. Now, while the sauce cooks is a great time to start cooking your pasta. While Marcella calls for a tagliatelle, I'd prefer a much broader noodle, something closer to a pappardelle, which I think just holds the sauce that much better. To make my pasta, I'm going to actually do it in my food processor, but I know that's sacrilege, but it does come out really great that way. You can use any pasta recipe that you want. Mine calls for about 2 cups of semolina flour, about 4 eggs, some olive oil, and salt. Pasta is very simple, but it's all about how you treat it. Once my dough is done and kneaded and nice and smooth, I'm sure to cover it with wax paper or something of the like that will keep it from losing its moisture, and I let it rest for about 30 minutes at least. I don't use plastic wrap in my house, so I'm using either wax paper or I'll be using beeswax coated cloth. You're going to break off a handful of dough at a time, and I run it through my pasta roller with a lot of flour until I've reached about level 5 thickness. I then cut the pasta into wide, thick, rustic noodles. These are not very pretty, but I don't really care. I fill my pasta pot with water, a lot of salt. You basically want something akin to seawater. And I set it to boil, all while checking the sauce and giving it an occasional stir. Once my sauce is ready, the pasta only takes a few minutes, so I just make a simple arugula salad with really good olive oil, lemon juice, and a little sprinkling of salt and some Parmesan cheese. I also need to make sure that I have a lot of the extra butter ready because you're going to be tossing the noodles in this butter. You want to test your noodles for doneness by just taking them out and tasting them. I found that's really the best way to do it. You want them to be cooked, but not mushy. Once my pasta is done cooking, I'm going to drain it well, and I'm going to pour it into the serving dish. I'm then going to top it with the rest of the butter and give it a nice toss to make sure that all the butter is coating the noodles. I also like to add a tiny bit more freshly grated nutmeg. I just think it goes really well with the fresh pasta and the butter. Then I'm going to spoon my beautiful Bolognese over the top. Now remember, I made double the recipe, so I'm only using about half of it. And then you cannot forget the freshly grated Parmigiano Reggiano right before serving. And there we have it, our beautiful, finished, all-day simmered Bolognese with fresh homemade pasta and salad, which makes a beautiful Sunday dinner. I'm just gonna plate up a bowl for myself and for my mother, and also for my children, although hopefully in a few years we'll be able to do this family style. Now that we're all ready with our plates, it's time to sit down and mangia. And now that we're done with dinner, it's on to dessert. I am taking out the maple custard that I made earlier, all while my non-Italian mother entertains my children by dancing to Italian music. This custard is so easy to make. I'm using Jazine Parato's recipe, and I just substituted the sugar for maple syrup and let it cool for about an hour. I'm then going to take out some chocolate chips and melt them in a double boiler with a little bit of cream. I don't really measure this out. I'm just making a very simple ganache to go over the top of my maple. So I'm going to keep stirring it over low heat. I want to make sure that the water doesn't touch the bottom of the bowl. And yes, I know I should probably own a double boiler at this point, but for some reason I don't. So you just want to keep stirring it until it melts. Just as it's finishing melting, I stir in about 2 tablespoons of softened unsalted butter, and I just continue to stir it around. In retrospect, I probably should have added a little more cream to this to thin it out, but it was perfect for when we wanted to eat it. Lastly, I'm going to take the most popular nut in this house, hazelnuts, and I am just going to crush them up. A lot of times I just put them on a mat and I use the jar that we hold them in to crush them up, which is maybe a little lazy, but it works perfectly for this. I'm going to sprinkle them over the top and enjoy. And there you have it, friends, a beautiful Sunday dinner with my favorite people. I will provide a link for all the recipes I used in the description below. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Oak and Ash Cooks.